Right, hi everybody. As I've already said, thanks for sparing the time to listen a little bit more about how we can use our interactions to support speech, language and communication development with all of the children that we work with. But of course, we're going to particularly focus on the strategies that will support those children who are not meeting age-related expectations. So, of course, we're also going to talk about Launchpad as well, because all of you have very it's great that you've all come on board with Launchpad through the support of Newcastle Local Authority and the North of the Tyne Combined Authority funding, so that we can really upskill ourselves, upskill yourselves as leaders, upskill your team to really look at children more closely, to understand this area of development in much more detail, and to be able to consider and make decisions about our practice and what children need with the support of that Launchpad toolkit. So let's have a think about how this afternoon session is going to pan out. So the biggest thing that we're going to do is we're going to talk about interactions, and we're going to talk about how we can have almost like a toolbox of different interaction strategies. And I'm going to talk through what some of those interaction strategies can be in that toolbox this afternoon. But what I'm going to try to do is talk to you about which strategies are particularly useful for which children, and which strategies are particularly useful for different age groups, and also for older children who have got skill gaps, which strategies would kind of match that. So that the idea is that you kind of have, moving forwards, this toolbox of strategies, and don't get me wrong, you will have and you will already be using some of these strategies already, but that you begin to pick and choose the strategies that you use with different children and in different moments of time to kind of match what children need. And so that's really what Launchpad is all about. It's about kind of keeping doing quite a lot of things that we might do already, learning a few new things, but then also beginning to become a little bit more informed and a little bit more upskilled about what those strategies are and what those strategies can help with, so that the delivery of Launchpad is just about evolving and tweaking your practice. It's not about stopping doing everything that you're doing and starting again or doing everything completely differently. It's really just a process of upskilling and then evolving and tweaking your practice as you begin to understand and learn more about this area of development. So once we've kind of talked through that kind of toolbox of strategies, we will have a little bit of a whiz around the Launchpad toolkit and think about how what we've talked about in the CPD correlates with the Launchpad toolkit, and I'll talk a little bit more about that then. So, of course, we're going to think about strategies this afternoon that will support all children in our settings. But before we get started, maybe just take a couple of minutes, or if you're watching this recording back in the setting, maybe press pause and take a couple of minutes to think of 2 or 3 target children. And by target children, I mean children where you're thinking, they're not meeting age-related expectations with speech, language and communication development. And maybe you're quite concerned about 1 or 2 of them, or it might be that you're not massively concerned, but you know that they've got some immaturities there. Just take a minute, and just for your own thinking, and we'll come back to these children at the end of the session, just write their initials or just write their first names down, or just hold their names in their heads, in your head. And then as we go through the strategies, we'll think about which strategies do you think might help with different children. So I'll shut up now to give you 2 minutes to do that, and then we'll crack on. Right, I'm sure you can think of lots of children who are not meeting age-related expectations, and let's face it, we know who these children are already. And certainly when you talk to people across the country, not just in the Northeast, people will often have a level of concern about 50% of early years children. Concerns that they're not quite meeting age-related expectations with speech, language and communication development. Of course, some of the children are of significant concern, but a lot of children have got skill gaps that aren't necessarily because they've got very specific and significant needs. Their skill gaps maybe because the child was a little bit late getting started with talking and learning language. Their skill gaps maybe because the child hasn't had a very broad and deep experience base. So what we're going to think about this afternoon is about supporting all children, but particularly about supporting children that you're beginning to think, I need to look at you a little bit more closely because you're not meeting age-related expectations. So when we go through this CPD, and Beth and I have just set a couple of dates for a couple more sessions moving towards the end of November and into January, we're going to be talking about embedding interventions and thinking about different layers of our practice. And this afternoon, we're going to focus on the most fundamental of those layers, which is the interactions that we have with the children. And these interactions are so valuable. It's unbelievable how valuable they are. And they're things that happen across our day in the setting. They're not resource specific. They can happen in the home corner. They can happen when we're using the Play-Doh with children. They can happen when we're having snack or when we're having dinner. They can happen when we're helping a child put their coats on. And these are ever-present interactions that pervade all aspects of our practice and our learning environment. And it's important that we get those right. And certainly, there's a lot of information out there in the early years world at the minute, which is about valuing interactions. And everybody talks about, the importance for high quality interactions, and we need a language rich environment. And that's all very lovely. But it's all very broad and it's not very specific. And it doesn't really kind of help us know how to tweak it when a child has got a speech and language skill gap. So what we're going to do this afternoon is try and look at that and look at this toolkit of strategies, which I mentioned right back at the beginning, and realise that this toolkit of strategies is good practice for all children, but that we can also use this toolbox of strategies in a very certain way to embed interventions into our practice. So when a child has got a skill gap, people will often talk about how they need interventions, and certainly in the world of schools, I think less so in settings, thankfully. We've fallen into the trap where we think that an intervention is taking a child or a group of children to the side and doing something separate, using certain resources or delivering certain little group activities. And don't get me wrong, interventions can be that, but actually the most effective and natural way of offering children with skill gaps interventions is to embed those interventions into the give and take of our EYFS practice, to make that practice really targeted with embedded interventions so that we are giving children what they need and the children don't even realise it because it's just part of our early years practice. and we can be much more effective with children, and it will be a much more holistic kind of way of working with children to have this notion of embedding interventions into our interactions. And I will also say that, in my opinion, you as leaders and practitioners in your setting, in your learning environment, you know, of course, your learning environment is important. The resources that you have, the way you set it up, of course, your learning environment is massively important. But before we get started on the detail, I will say that you and your team are the most important resource in that room, because you are the ones that can support children and model and coach them to use the resources that you have available. But in addition, you're the ones that can add language and interact with those children as they engage in the learning environment and within your daily routines. I think that's really important, to always have that sense of value and that sense of, you know, just how fundamentally important what you're doing and the skills that you're putting in place, what they, you know, you're putting the foundations in place that really everything else will be built on. So let's have a think. Let's start to think about having a toolbox, but let's start thinking about having a toolbox that we can separate into different compartments, into different sections. So strategies that will be better to pull out and use to develop certain skills and with certain age group. So to begin with, we're going to talk about a set of interaction strategies that are particularly useful for building early communication skills and early language skills. So if we're talking about good practice for all, these strategies will be really useful when we're interacting with children from, say, well, some of them with babies as well, but say, for example, 12 months to our kind of 2.5, 3-year-olds. So if we're working with those younger children within our provision, all of the children in that age group will benefit from these strategies. Some more at different times than others, but that's kind of like the age group we would be talking about. However, these very same strategies that we're going to talk about next will also be useful for those slightly older children, those children who might be 3, 3.5, 4, but who are still struggling to communicate with us, to tune into our faces, to tune into our voices. They're struggling to respond when we speak to them. They're not particularly communicating with us, even non-verbally. It might be that they're still highly distractible. They're finding it very difficult to listen. They're finding it very difficult to understand and tune in to what we're saying. So what we see is this little compartment in our toolbox, this little compartment of strategies, is good practice for everybody when the children are younger and when the children are at an earlier stage of language development. But these very same strategies should come out of our toolbox to be used with older children when they've got skill gaps where they should be up here, but in reality, when it comes to their early communication and their early language skills, they're still at a much earlier stage of development. They're still at a much earlier level of success. So when we're thinking about interacting with the younger children or with older children who still need support with these very early foundation communication and language skills, before we even begin to discuss and think about what we're going to say, we first of all have to think about how we position ourselves when we are interacting with children. And with younger children or with older children who still need a lot of support to tune into people, to tune into language, to tune into communication, what I need to think about is, wherever possible, to create opportunities where I can be opposite the child so that we can be face to face and that I can be down at that child's level. And I think we would do that instinctively with younger children. But when we have got older children, and most of those children are moving on, we need to remember that those key target children who need more support would still benefit from us being opposite them and down on their level. So say, for example, I've got a 3.5-year-old in my 3 to 4 year provision, and that child is, for want of a better example, exploring resources in the water tray, and there's 2 other children there, and I'm going to go in that area to spend some time in that area interacting with the children, modelling play, adding language. What I do as I walk into that kind of environment, that little area, is I have a quick scan of who is there, and I think, right, who needs the most support? And I clock that one of the children is one of my target children who needs really kind of much earlier support. And so when I come into that area, I position myself opposite that child and on a face-to-face, and have maybe the other children next to me or diagonally opposite, because they can cope with interactions that are not face-to-face. But my slightly older but target child who needs a lot of support still needs me to position myself in that way. When we're interacting with the much younger children, or when we're interacting with an older child who still needs a lot of support, we need to kind of say, right, oh, well, who's going to lead this interaction? And what we need to do is we need to follow the child's lead. And I think, again, we would instinctively do that with the younger children. But when I've got an older child who is still at an earlier level of success, most of the other older children, I'm beginning to have little chats with them. I'm beginning to say to them, oh, look at this. Or I'm beginning to be able to do something and then draw the children's attention over to what I'm doing. But with children who need me to go back, I need to kind of say, right, okay, I need to follow the child's lead here. So once I've got down on the child's level, and where possible, I'm face to face, rather than starting to talk about what I think I should talk about or what I think the child should learn about, I need to not talk, and I need to wait, and I need to watch, and I need to listen. And sometimes if I just wait, the child might actually say something. But most of the time with older children who are at these earlier levels of success, what actually happens is I wait, and I wait for the child to do something. And it might be that the child does something. So if we were in that water, they might kind of move a boat. And they might have moved the boat in that way, whether I was there or not. You know, it might be that they move the boat and then look to me and then look back to the boat because they're wondering what my reaction is going to be. Or it might be that they move the boat and then move it towards me. So whatever it is, they've either deliberately kind of sent me a signal, or they haven't sent me any signal because they would have just done this anyway. But whatever they do, it's at that point that I then think about adding language. And by doing this, what I've done is I have accepted what the child is doing and their non-verbal communication. And I've accepted that, but I've also taken that as the child having a turn in the interaction. So I've waited for the child to almost like kick it off, to initiate the interaction, by doing something, and then I've taken what they've done as the first turn in that conversation or interaction. And then when I do say something, it's important as well that I use quite a lot of non-verbal communication myself at these early stages of development, that I might use quite exaggerated facial expression. I might make sure that my voice is a little bit more interesting rather than kind of just flat and dull. And also I might use my hands as I say something, or if I'm talking about an object. So if the child's got a boat and then there's another boat and I happen, it might be that I hold the boat up next to my face and as I say something about the boat, so that I am saying, like, you are a young child who needs to learn to tune into me. Or you're an older child who is struggling to tune into me, who still might be massively distractible, who still is kind of not instinctively communicating and kind of taking on board language in the same way that other children are. And by using that exaggerated non-verbal communication, what you're doing, for want of a better phrase, is you're making yourself more interesting, and you're saying, here are some words, but also here is some non-verbal communication to help you to tune into me visually as well as listening to me. And that's really all that you're doing. And again, when we think about these things, a lot of these things we will do automatically. If we are communicating with a much younger child, we have to still remember to use these strategies and these skills when we're working with older children who are still at an earlier level of success. When I do say something, I want to add language and say something about what the child has done. That is so important. It is crucial that when I add language, what I say matches what the child is thinking about. If I say something different, if I say something about what I think is interesting or what I think the child should learn about, and it doesn't match what the child is doing and it doesn't match what the child is thinking about, then, for want of a better phrase, what I've said will in reality go over the top of that child's head. So I'm not actually adding and building language because what I've said doesn't match what the child is thinking about. So that's really, really crucial. And when I do say something with that exaggerated facial expression, I'm going to say just a really short phrase, possibly just with one main word, and then I'm going to leave a gap. And the gap is important because the gap will give the children time to begin to process what I have said. But as well as giving them time to process what I have said, because if I keep talking, I lose them. It also gives them time to have another turn, to either say something back or to do something again. And then again, I will say something about what they've done the next time. So that's really important. And when I do say something, as well as it being a short phrase, it's really important that I just say something about what the child has done. I make a statement. I don't ask a question. Because really what I am thinking about here is trying to hook the child into me, to add language, and that's what I'm trying to achieve. I'm trying to achieve some interaction. The purpose here is not to try and get the child to talk. And that's what questions are for. Questions are to prompt talk, to prompt finding out what children know. Now is not the time to do that. I need to focus on adding language and feeding language in and trying to get some more interaction going. The talk will come later, but that's not my aim at the minute with children like this. And again, when I add my next little chunk of language, when I have my next turn, if the child has done something completely different, don't get me wrong, you can say something different. But at this very early stage of language, with those older children who need the most support, there is nothing wrong. If anything, it's really beneficial just to say the same thing or nearly the same thing again, so that rather than using lots and lots of different words, the child is getting to hear a few words, but they're getting to hear those words again and again and again. And at these very early stages of language development, that repetition is really crucial. It's not about how much you say. It's not about the quantity of talk. It's about the quality of your talk. And actually, with children who need the most support, if you talk too much, you will actually be not helping as much as if you take it right back and be much more simple, much more repetitive. And also if you take that time to wait and to follow the child's lead. And I think sometimes with older children, where we're concerned, our concern can sometimes push us into talking too much. And if you notice yourself doing that, or if you notice a member or a few members of your team doing that, or we can sometimes with children who are a bit older and who are maybe not really interacting that much, not saying very much, we can find ourselves suddenly starting to say lots to them or ask them lots of questions because we're concerned and because we want to help. But I suppose what we're talking about today is to say, that's understandable, but as soon as you notice, you need to put the brakes on and you need to say, right, okay, there is a better way to do this. Let's kind of go back in order to move forwards with these children. So again, with children who are younger, which we would do naturally, but with older children who need really basic backtracking for basic communication and early language skills, what we will notice with a lot of those older children is that they will maybe have quite limited play. So they might every day go to the same thing. They might go to the trains or they might go to certain building blocks, but they go there every day. And maybe they've got one other activity that they like to do outside. And again, it's really easy to say, oh, well, he goes to the trains because he likes the trains. It's what he's interested in. And I think, of course, the child is interested in, but the child in the trains, but the child goes to the trains because they know what to do. They feel safe. They know how to explore and play with those resources. They don't go to the other areas because they don't know how to use them. They don't know how to play in that way. And what we often find in particular is that children with language delay and children with communication difficulties can find pretend play and also our creative resources particularly tricky. So again, as well as utilising these basic interaction strategies, one of the best ways that we can just drip feed in little bits of support for these children is just to, of course, let them play with the trains, but sometimes to put a little bit of time in to take them to kind of a different area, and it might be the Play-Doh or it might be the home corner. But what I would do is, rather than taking them to lots of different areas, I would spend a little bit of time taking them back to another, but the same area a few times, where within that you would put in those interaction strategies, but you would also model and coach some really basic, simple play in that area to show the child how to use the resources, how to play in that way, and that is a really deep layer of intervention, which is just about supporting those skills. And what we know, and what I used to be a speech and language therapist, is if we can expand children's play repertoire, if we can begin to get a little bit of pretend play going that wasn't there before, it can have a positive knock-on effect on their communication and language development. So again, it's a really important part of our toolbox, so that within our interaction strategy toolbox, we've also got that notion of interaction and building play at the same time. It is a really fundamental part of what we do. And I also think we need to remember the value of little interaction games that are all about supporting children to tune into us and to communicate more. And again, these are things that we would instinctively do with younger children. And so therefore, if we go through a few examples of those now, it's again just adding that kind of, we need to keep remembering to do this with all of our younger children. But again, to remember to bring these interaction games back out of that toolbox when you've got an older child who needs more support. Because when that child is older, you will probably not instinctively play some of these interaction games, but for that child, they would still be particularly useful. So let's have a think about just a couple of examples, just so that we see that this is nothing unusual or nothing that we don't know about already. So interaction games are about those games that kind of more are about play between people, but they're about kind of encouraging interaction and communication. So I suppose the most common one and the most familiar one would be when we play peekaboo, when we play peekaboo with much younger children. But again, for a slightly older child who's not particularly communicating, not particularly interacting, you know, to play peekaboo with blankets, to play peekaboo behind a fence, you know, to play peekaboo behind a book, are really lovely and useful ways to help children engage with us. And sometimes we can get very kind of passive older children who aren't particularly interacting. And then when we start to play peekaboo, the eye contact comes, little giggles come, and you think, oh, where did all of that come from? And it's because we've taken our interaction back and worked on the skills that that child needs. And also, by the time a child is older, we expect the child to be playing with resources and to play with them. And sometimes we need to go back to that, where actually what we're doing is we're just playing with our faces, we're playing with our voices, and that's what the game is. Certainly, when I send the CPD index through to you in the next couple of days, there will be some CPD opportunities where you can kind of listen to these things in a little bit more detail if you've got children where you think, oh, I need to kind of think about that a little bit more, we need to go into that in a little bit more depth. And in the supporting early communication video, I talk a lot about using bubbles, which I class as a high interest resource. And I'll not go into it in the full detail here because we want to get through quite a bit. If you want to hear more, kind of watch that video or bits of that video. But again, if I use high interest kind of resources like bubbles, the way I would use them to kind of promote communication would be that I would blow some bubbles to get the child interested. Nearly every child loves bubbles in my experience. But then what you would do is, rather than just keeping blowing the bubbles, you would blow some and then you would put the wand back in, and then you would just wait and look at the child. And what you're doing is you're saying to the child, come on, communicate to me that you want me to blow some more. And at the moment, this child is unlikely to say, please, can you blow some more bubbles? That's not going to happen. But what I want, for some children, I just want them to look at me and then to look to the bubbles and then look back to me. For some children, that's progress. They've used their eye contact to show me that they want some more bubbles. For other children, they might look to the bubbles, look to me and go, Again, that might be progress. Another child might try to grab my hand and move it for me to blow the bubbles. Now, if the child is doing any of those things to non-verbally communicate, please, can I have some more bubbles? Then I blow some more bubbles. But before I do that, I model their next step. And I would just say one word. I would go, more, more. And then I would blow some bubbles, blow a few bubbles, but then leave the gap. So again, I've got this turn-taking routine. And in the next training session, we'll talk a lot about turn-taking, but this is just like a turn-taking routine and interaction. If the child made progress and was saying more, more, if the child was saying more in their own way, and I would say, oh, more bubbles, more bubbles. And if the child made progress again and was saying, more bubble, I would say, oh, blow more bubbles, blow more bubbles. So every time I'm leaving that gap to try and get the child to have more turns. And then when they have a turn, I accept it, but then I use my turn to try and make that turn a little bit better. Let's have a think about just a couple more before we move on to the next section. So, of course, we've got interaction songs and rhymes. And again, by the time children are a little bit older, we're expecting them to share songs and rhymes in groups, and we might have moved more onto action rhymes and finger rhymes and counting rhymes. But if we go back to early development, you can use songs and rhymes in a much more interactive way on a one-to-one. So we do row, row, row the boat, where we sit on the floor. We sing those really simple and familiar songs and rhymes again and again, but we leave gaps in them, or we do them, and then at the end we wait and the child has to show me that they want more. You know, and again, just to remember that those interaction routines that we might instinctively share with younger children can still have a lot of value for those older children who need a lot of early support. And also as well, remember that a lot of these children, if we're beginning to share our songs and rhymes mainly in groups, it might be that these children find that really tricky. They might be quite disruptive. They might opt out and kind of run away from that group. It might be that they stay on the carpet, but they're kind of really passive. So it looks like they're not interested in songs and rhymes. But really what is happening is they're just telling you in their own way that the child is telling you, I don't have the skill set at the moment to engage in songs and rhymes in this way. But if you go back a bit, you might be able to use songs and rhymes to build my skills, to build my communication skills, to build my interaction and language skills, but also to help me learn to enjoy songs and rhymes in a much more simple way, which will help me work towards being able to enjoy and share songs and rhymes within a group, within a more difficult way. And of course, by this age as well, we're expecting children to be listening to stories, often in a group, although we will still find opportunities to share books and stories with smaller impromptu groups or run one-to-one. But actually for some children, again, they might show very little or no interest in stories and books. But if I go back and allow them to have experiences and interactions with me with multisensory books, you know, touchy-feely books, books that have got soft bits or rough bits or bits that have got shiny bits. You know, the most obvious ones that spring to mind will be, you know, those Usborne, That's Not My Car, or That's Not My Monster type books, where we can experience the book, but we can have an interaction around that book, rather than just listening to language. So again, there is language there around the book, and there is that book skill, opening the book, turning the pages, you know, getting an interest in books. But actually the fact that we can touch different things, or look at different things, means that we can get a higher level of engagement and a higher level of interaction if we take it back. And in the same way, lift the flap books, because they've got kind of something to do, and lift the flap books are always useful as well, because you can actually begin to have some little peekaboo routines, but with Spot or whoever who might be under the flap. And again, none of this is rocket science, and this is all stuff that we would think of doing with younger children, but it's about bringing some of those strategies out of our toolkit and still using them with the older children who still need us to go back that far and who still need that deeper level of support. So before we go on and think about the building kind of more like the next step of language, maybe just take a minute to think about, what of those strategies do you think you use, and do you use them with the younger children? But do you also use them with some of the older children who need them? You know, what do you do already from what I've just said? And of your target children, are you beginning to think, I wonder whether we need to do a little bit more of that with such and such? Just take a minute. Again, this is something that you're going to want to think about a little bit more afterwards, but just take a minute now before we kind of move on to the next chunk of the toolbox. Right, we'll move on, because I want to make sure that we leave enough time for questions and things at the end. But what we're going to do now is we're going to investigate another little compartment in our toolbox, which are kind of strategies that allow us to move on to the next level, I suppose. So if we think about different levels of speech, language and communication, the first level is what I suppose we've just talked about, which is the ability to tune into people, to tune into faces and voices, to begin to have some two-way interactions, and to begin to have some really basic listening and some really basic understanding of language. And that was what all that kind of purple section was about. But then what I need to then think about is, right, okay, well, I've got early communication skills in place. This child is responding to me. They are, communicating with me. They might not be talking to me yet. They might be tapping me on the shoulder to get attention. They might be pointing, but there is that communication there. What do I need to build next? And if we think about speech and language, what we often think is, right, okay, well, what I need to build next is I need to build talking skills. But in reality, what you need to build next, and what the most fundamental next set of skills would be the ability to listen and understand when other people speak to the child, and also to build their vocabulary. And of course, at the same time, the child will be learning to talk as well. But that listening and understanding and the building of vocabulary need to almost like be put in place before the child is then able to use those skills in their own talk. And if we think about an older child who maybe is not saying as much as they should, maybe they've only got a handful of single words, when all of their peers, or most of their peers, are now using longer sentences, it stands out that their level of talk is significantly lower than their peers. But actually, when I think about that child, and I think about how well they can listen to me, how well they can understand me, how well they learn vocabulary, how quickly they learn new words, I realize that there are gaps with those skills. So if I want them to use more words, to use a bigger pot of words, to expand their vocabulary, and if I want them to then begin to link those words together into 2-word, then 3-word phrases, and then into sentences. So if I do want to improve the amount that they say, what I actually have to do is build their listening and understanding and their ability to learn words first, because until I work on those skills, which are at an earlier level of success as well, then the talk won't improve. Does that kind of make sense? So again, sometimes our level of concern can kind of push us into trying to get children like that to talk more, to say more, to ask them lots of questions because we want to hear them talk. But really, when I'm taking my strategies out of my toolbox, I want to be thinking more about strategies that will support the building of listening, understanding, and the learning of vocabulary. So we'll go through some of these skills now. And again, the same stands. This is good practice for all children at a certain moment in time. It becomes intervention when I've got older children who should be able to do these things but can't. So I go back to use these strategies to support those skills. So when I've got a child who is communicating but who is still quite distractible, who still finds it difficult to listen, and they might be quite flitty and distractible, or they might just be really passive and, just for want of a better phrase, float around the session. So they're not kind of disruptive, but they're finding it difficult to focus. They're finding it difficult to pay attention just to one thing at once. Again, when I interact with children who still need support with those listening and understanding skills, it continues to be beneficial for me to be face to face with those children wherever possible, and to be on their level where possible. Even though that early communication is in place, they still will need that support to listen and hold their attention. If I am beginning to do some small group focus work with my children, because maybe this child is in the 3 to 4 year old provision, and again, that depends on your pedagogy, but again, you might be doing some small group focus work. that child will probably find it difficult to listen and to take turns in a group, might struggle to kind of know what to do within a task, might just sit passively, but also might be quite disruptive. The best thing that I can do in that situation would be to sit that child opposite me so that they can still be face to face, so that when I'm doing small group work, rather than sitting the children I'm most concerned about next to me, I sit them opposite me. So I'm thinking about visual closeness rather than physical closeness. So that's again a strategy we've already discussed, but it continues to be beneficial when I'm thinking about building listening and understanding skills. Again, because the child can talk, and I think I've already said this, it's easy to begin to ask this child, a lot more questions, and again, ask even more questions because I want to hear the child talk and I'm concerned. But again, remembering that when we talk, we would be far more productive if we just make a comment, if we say something about what the child has got, if we say something about what the child is doing, if we say something about what I am doing, rather than asking a question. And certainly a friend of mine who I used to work with as a therapist in Sunderland, who then went on to work in Newcastle briefly and then finished her career in Gateshead, a fabulous speech and language therapist called Lynn Jones. She always used to say, be a word feeder, not a word retriever. And I think that that's the most fabulous phrase. Rather than trying to ask questions, to drag words out and to hear children talk, focus on adding language in, feeding those words in, and then you will be much more productive at building language skills. When you are adding language, it's useful to have this kind of thought process of what is called a next step sentence. So say, for example, if a child is using single words, then what you might want to do is just accept that word, but then repeat it back, but with a little bit of grammatical padding to turn it into a little sentence, a little phrase, but that phrase just has one main word. Or if the child is using two words together, when you talk to them, you want to be using sentences that are modeling their next step. So rather than using sentences that have got lots of words in, you want to be using sentences that are a little bit longer than what the child is able to use, so that the child is using sentences like this and then or words like this, and then you're modeling a slightly longer, a slightly more complicated sentence, which will allow the important words that they need to copy and the important early grammatical structure that they need to listen to stand out. If you use a sentence that's too kind of different and too much longer than what the child is able to say, it's not an achievable model that they can have a go at copying. And also, we need to remember that a lot of the children are using these shorter sentences because their understanding of what we say is also delayed. So not only, if we use long sentences, not only is it an unachievable model for the child to copy, but on top of that, they might not even really understand what we've said because we've added too much language. So again, thinking about when you're talking to the child, that notion of next step sentences. So you're always saying a little bit more, you're always getting that progression, you're always building the skill, but you're not saying 10 steps more, which is unachievable. It's the next step. And that's a really interesting but very practical one to think about. And when you're thinking about your target children and you're thinking, right, well, how do we need to talk to that child? You know, it's like, yes, how do we need to position ourselves? Do we need to still follow the child's lead all the time? But again, how long should our sentences be? And that next step sentence kind of strategy or thought process really helps and supports with that. Building vocabulary and building understanding, it's still really important that we are repetitive, as in we say less words, but we say them more often. So if you are, I don't know, playing with the farm, for example, rather than thinking, oh, this is an opportunity for them to learn all of these different types of things, you're better off saying less words, but saying each word more often. Because what will happen is you will have children in your setting who have no problem with learning new vocabulary. And those children will need to hear you say a word 2, 3, 4 times. And then before you know it, they have understood it. And then they begin to have a go at using it themselves. For children who have got language delay and language issues, they will need to hear you say a word lots and lots and lots of times before they're able to understand it. And they will also need to hear you say a word again and again and again before they are in a position where they begin to use it themselves. So again, for those older children who just seem to take longer to learn new words, seem to struggle to learn new words, retain new words, you just think that they've got a new word and then the next week it's gone. Again, remembering to go back and saying less, but saying things more often is a really important strategy. And as we're building language, it's important that we do something called build semantic links. And that really just means that understanding that certain words go together. And when a child is a little bit older and when they've got strong language skills, we build semantic links by chatting, by talking about things, by having conversations about the world around us, or by sharing stories. And because their language skills are strong, they're able to learn and process these conversations or these stories. And that is how they learn more and more new words. But because they learn that certain words go together and they're connected together, that's how they also build strong knowledge and understanding of the world. With children who are at earlier stages of language development, we need to kind of do the same thing, but do it a little bit more simply and within kind of shorter sentences. So if I'm in the mark making area and we're drawing, I might pick up a pencil and I say, oh, I've got a pencil. I'm going to draw with my pencil. I'm drawing a man with my pencil. So they don't just know that this is a pencil. They know that the verb to draw goes with the word pencil. If we've got books and I say, oh, let's read a book. We'll read a book. Let's open it up. So the words read and open and story go with a book. If I'm in the home corner and there's a spoon, I might comment that this is a shiny spoon and I'm going to stir my tea with the spoon, so that the child knows that this is called a spoon, but they also know that the doing word to stir goes with the spoon, and that for this spoon in particular, The concept of being shiny goes with that spoon. And then later on, when we're using something else that's shiny, and I happen to use the word shiny along, they think, ah, right, okay, that word goes with that thing as well. Okay, I've got you. So really, this is not about necessarily doing new things, but it's about just thinking about, reflecting, talking to your team about how when you're adding language, and when you're adding language and you're not just naming anymore, you're adding language, but you're using the doing word, or you're using a describing word. Or maybe if you're in the small world area and you say, oh, I need an animal for the farm. I'm going to get a horse. So the child doesn't just learn that it's called a horse, but that the word horse goes with animal, and it also goes with farm. Does that kind of make sense? It doesn't have to go with farm, but there you go. But that really, as you're kind of adding language, is what you're doing. You're building vocabulary, but because you're using these words together, you're not just helping them learn more and more new words, you're helping them connect words together. And that is so crucial for so many things later in life. And within what I've just said, I've kind of talked about making sure that you emphasize doing words, like a pencil for drawing, a book for reading, a spoon for stirring. And I think just generally, if you're wanting to build vocabulary, but also if you're wanting to build future levels of talk, if you and your team just generally do a lot more talking about what is happening. So talking about what the child is doing, talking about what you are doing. If you're looking at a picture in a book, talking about what is happening in the picture, where you're building those doing words, and you're also adding and modeling language where you're describing activity. That is a really kind of useful thing to do. And I think we do that already, but I also think when we're concerned about children, we can often fall into the naming trap. Let's name lots of things for these children because they don't know what many things are called. And then we fall into the describing trap. Let's talk about what colour it is, or let's talk about, and don't get me wrong, describing what things are like is important as well. But sometimes what we forget to do enough is to talk about what's happening and to talk about what we're doing. And that is a really easy shift. And again, it's sometimes not even a big shift because you will do that already. But what you might suddenly do is just to decide to do that a little bit more. That little shift and that little tweak in practice can have really kind of positive knock-on effects for lots and lots of children. And again, for some children, it will build their understanding. For other children, it will really push them and boost them into beginning to use more sentences and to beginning to talk more. So in the last kind of very early communication section, we talked about kind of songs and rhymes and kind of books and things like that. But again, if we're thinking about kind of our use of books to kind of move on to the next level of language, again, of course, we'll be sharing stories and using books in the conventional way, but remembering that value of talking about pictures in books as well as just reading the text. And there we can really build vocabulary by talking about what we can see. And like I've just said before, we can talk about what's happening in those pictures, which is really good for building language, but also visual skills as well. And again, remember, for children who still struggle to listen and understand, we need to be really careful about how long stories are, how much language that they've got in them. Sometimes we've maybe begun to read stories that are a little bit too long and a little bit too complex for certain children to keep up. They might be more beneficial if they have stories with less language in, or that if we do read stories with more language, that we read a chunk, but we leave gaps in between the language so they've got time to process. But also as well, that idea of reading the same story again and again and again has a lot of value. So they get to hear the same words, they get to hear the same vocabulary, they get to kind of have numerous opportunities to understand and learn the sequence of that story. Because again, children at earlier stages of language development, or who aren't as quick to learn language, that repetition will be really valuable. And again, for children who struggle to listen or retell stories, then you know, sharing stories, but where we've got actions, where we've got props, can really help them to keep their focus, to keep their attention, to physically join in the story, and then after the story to act out bits or kind of demonstrate bits of the story, because if it came to just retelling the story, they would probably struggle to do that. But by acting out bits of the story and then adding words around that, that will slowly build that child up towards that skill of being able to retell stories. And again, songs and rhymes, as we know in the EYFS, continue to be highly valuable. But again, if children have got issues with listening and understanding, repetition and familiarity is still really important. I don't want to be singing kind of new ones all the time, because again, that will be okay for my children with strong language. But if I keep singing new ones and different ones, or if I keep singing ones and, you know, too many verses, then for my children with earlier levels of language and understanding and vocabulary, that will be more difficult. And again, of course, we're using action rhymes, either big actions or finger songs and finger actions with our songs and rhymes. But again, that use of props can support children's understanding and ability to participate. But again, as they're beginning to use language and have more, then with those repetitive familiar songs, that notion of leaving gaps at familiar points can be really useful, to almost like give children little achievable gaps that they can fill in if they can't yet kind of sing and retain the whole song. So again, nothing there is difficult, nothing there is particularly unusual. I suppose it's about kind of matching those strategies to different skills and to different children. So again, unfortunately, now I've shared my screen, I can't see any of you, but if you just take a minute to kind of think, what do we do already from what she's just said? And also, if I'm thinking about those, you know, what do we do with the younger children? You know, but if I'm thinking about some children who have got some kind of concerns and some needs, are there any strategies in there that we use already? But also, am I thinking, oh, that would be a useful one to try with certain children? Have a minute and then we'll move on to the next section. Right, we're not quite, but we're nearly at the end of investigating our toolbox of interaction strategies. So all of the things that we've talked about already will work towards building talk in our children. So if we build early communication skills, it will put in the foundation on which talk is built. But I can't jump straight to work on talk if the child isn't interacting and communicating. Building listening and understanding skills will provide the children with the skills that they need in order to be able to talk. So again, building those skills is so fundamental. And then if I build those skills, the talk will follow. But of course, I also want to be building talk as children get older. And there will be some children where I want to build talk, because when I think about their listening and understanding, do you know what? Those skills are not that bad. It's actually more just when it comes to the use of sentences and the use of speech sounds that this child begins to find things tricky. So let's begin to think about some of these strategies that we can bring out of a different compartment of our toolbox to use with all children sometimes, but to use with certain children more than others. And again, we'll find that they're all quite simple things. So when I'm thinking about building talk, it's not just I want a child to talk more, it's how do I want to make that child's talk better? And do you know what? Sometimes if I want the child to talk more, it's more I need to work on their interaction skills, which we're going to talk about next. But if a child, if I'm wanting to improve their talk in terms of the quantity and quality of their talk, there are three things that I kind of need to be thinking about. Am I wanting to improve their utterance length? Is it that their sentences or their little phrases need to gradually get a little bit longer and longer? Or is it that I want to improve the types of words they use within their sentences, the number of words, but also do they sometimes use this one, that one, it, there, do this, got this, put this. So again, they might be talking in sentences, but when I look at the words that they use, they're often very non-specific or empty words. Or is it that I want to improve their grammatical structure? Is it that I've got an older child who is still saying me this, me that, him this, him that, them, instead of I, he, they, for example? Or is it that I want to be improving all three of those things with certain children, or maybe just two of those things? And so again, moving away from just thinking how much do children say to thinking, well, what is it about their talk exactly that I'm wanting to improve? So if we're thinking about our interaction strategies, and if I'm wanting to improve their utterance length, to gradually make their sentences longer, then I can go back and use that kind of next step sentence idea. So I think, right, they're using kind of two-word phrases. So when I talk to them, I want to be using slightly longer, but not too much longer sentences. So even when the child isn't talking to me and I'm the one saying something, I'm the one adding language, I'm modeling sentences at their next step. So again, that's a strategy that we talked about before, but that continues to be useful here. But when a child says something to me, I can use a strategy which is so easy but so productive. which is called repeat back and add one, which is where I accept what the child has said, but when I have a turn in the interaction, I repeat back what they've said, but I add another piece of information. And so what I'm doing is I am saying, I'm accepting what you have said, I am keeping the conversation going. You have no sense that I'm correcting you at all. You don't even know that I'm working on your language because we're just playing and talking together. But actually what I'm doing in my turn of this interaction is I am showing you how in a few days or a few weeks' time, you could begin to use very similar sentences, but you could make them a little bit longer like this. That's what I'm doing. And at the same time, I'm helping the child also maybe learn a new word and also to learn how these words can go together. So it's a really simple but productive strategy. And again, you might think, oh yeah, we do that. If you do that, talk about how you do that and value what you do, and also make sure that everybody in your team does that, and everybody in your team understands and values that strategy and also puts that into practice when they're interacting with children. It is no use just one person in the setting using these interaction strategy. It's got to be something that we work towards upskilling the whole team on, but also those people who do it instinctively but might not even be aware of what they're doing. By talking about it, you make that person realize just what it is that they're doing, and then by realizing it, you add value to it, and then that person might actually end up doing that even more often because now they've become aware of it. So if I am wanting to make a child's utterances better, but not necessarily longer, a strategy that I could use could be repeat back and refine. So if I've got a child who, and I'm thinking about Jack, who was in my last full-time class, when, he was using sentences that were relatively okay in terms of length, but when we were baking, for example, one day, he would say, I'm doing this, look at me, I'm doing this, as he was mixing the cake. So again, he's using sentences, and I'm thinking, right, okay, I'm not necessarily worried about making your sentence longer at this point, Jack. But what I would like to do when I have my turn is to accept what you've said, to keep that conversation going, but to repeat it back, but to add more specific words. So I accept what he says. I might say, oh, look, you're mixing the cake. You're really good at mixing the cake. So again, and then I leave it, and then he has his turn again. So I have refined his use of vocabulary to help him learn new, more specific words, but also to show him how to make that sentence a little bit better without him even realizing it. And then the other way that I might want to use repeat back and refine is if a child's got grammatical immaturities. And again, all of these things will be commonly and normally found in language development. So if a young child says, I run to the sand, or I run to the tree, instead of I ran to the tree, we might not think of it's a problem because they're just still quite young. And of course, it's not a massive problem because that's what you would call an irregular use of past tense. But it's still important that we accept what they've said, but we say, oh, you ran to the tree, did you? Oh, you ran to the tree. You're a very fast runner, aren't you? So again, we take what they've said, but we model it back and add the correct one. But there will be some grammatical immaturities that begin to stand out as you should be kind of moving on from that. So as children get a bit older, if they're still saying, me got a pen, you know, when they're little, that didn't stand out an awful lot, but as they get older and they're still doing that, we kind of begin to think, they should be really starting to use I. And again, these things are really easy to kind of model. If they're saying him on the red bike, then we say, oh yes, he's on the red bike. He likes the red bike, doesn't he? So again, we keep the conversation going, but when I repeat it back and refine it, I make sure that I'm modeling that kind of next step. If the child is saying, me got a pen, then the only thing that I have to remember is I need to model I, but it has to make sense. So if the child says, me has got a pen, and I haven't got one, I've got two options. I either say, oh, yes, you've got a pen. I have not got a pen. Or you grab a pen as well and you say, oh, yes, you've got a pen and I've got a pen. So the me, I is the only one where you need to do something a little bit different than just repeat it straight back, because you've got to use the word I about yourself. Otherwise, it doesn't make sense. And if you want to keep the conversation going, you just have to think, not an awful lot, but you just have to think a little bit more laterally about how do I model I, but how do I keep the conversation going and keep what I am saying making sense. And if I've noticed that Jack needs lots of doing words modelling, or if I've noticed that George needs he, she, them, I modelling quite a lot, then as well as repeating it back when they've used it and refining it and making it better when it's my turn, what I might also find myself doing is when I'm talking to Jack or when I'm talking to George, is I might deliberately use, when I'm talking to Jack, I might deliberately use a lot more doing words, a lot more verbs, a lot more talking about what's happening when I'm with Jack, because I know that that's his next step. When I'm with George, I might find that I begin to deliberately use a lot more talking about what the other children are doing. So I can deliberately model they or he or she, or talking about what I'm doing, so that I can deliberately model using the word I about myself. And again, so I'm playing, I'm keeping the conversation going, but I might start just use that type of language a little bit more to give him more repetitive opportunities to hear me using it in the next step way. And speech sounds kind of is a very similar thing, in that when a child says a word with sounds missing or sounds substituted and swapped for one another, the best practice is to accept what the child has said, but to repeat it back in the right way. So if a child says to you, Tanya fattened my tote, you would say, oh, your coat. Of course I can fasten your coat. So again, I'm repeating back the whole sentence with the right sounds, but I also might pull out one of the main words with that sound in and say it by itself, just so, and slightly exaggerate it without making a big thing of it, just to kind of help the child listen to the one word and then the sentence. So again, what you're doing is you're embedding an intervention and you're supporting that child in the give and take of what you're doing, and in this instance helping them put their coat on, but the child has got no sense that you're working on skills or that you're embedding interventions at all. So we're very, very quickly going to talk about the last part of our toolbox. But again, just take a minute to kind of think, did any children kind of spring to mind? Are those strategies things that you do already? Are there things that you want to and need to talk about with your team? Again, just take a minute before we kind of do the last compartment, very quick compartment of our toolbox. Right, very quickly before we have a quick look at the Launchpad toolkit and talk about our next steps in Newcastle. Right back at the beginning, we had some purple strategies for early communication where we talked about positioning, following a child's lead. But of course, that was all about those very early, those very kind of basic early two-way communication skills. As a child begins to communicate and have two-way communication, and as they begin to learn to listen and understand and learn words and learn to talk, they will continue to be learning how to interact at gradually higher and higher levels with us and with other children. And again, most of the children in response to a learning environment, in response to being around other children, in response to our interactions, will build these skills naturally. But there will be some children where we will need to put a little bit more thought and a little bit more effort into the building of what we would call social communication skills. And on Launchpad skills frameworks, that's called pragmatics, but we'll talk about that in a minute. And certainly lots and lots of people are saying to me that it is social communication, interacting with other children and just interacting, that a lot of children seem to have been affected by lockdowns and COVID with, as in children seem to be quieter, they seem to be kind of more playing in isolation, struggling to take turns, struggling to play kind of collaboratively when you would expect them to. So again, we're going to talk more just about interaction strategies here, but in the next training session, we will talk quite a bit about building those turn-taking skills within the learning environment. But an interesting thing to think about for the children who are beginning to use some language, who are beginning to interact, is, do they actually initiate interactions? Do they start interactions off? Do they come to you to show you things, to tell you things because they want your attention? They might come and start by talking. They might come and start by tapping you on the shoulder and then talking. But of course, when we talk to the child, they respond to us, but the child also starts interactions off. And I think that is a really interesting question to ask, because there will be some children who can talk, but who are very quiet, who are very passive, maybe quite solitary. And before you know it, when we ask this question, we think, oh, do you know what? We always talk first. We always say something first, or we always ask a question first. And it's really difficult to know. It's like chicken and an egg. Does the child wait for you to say something first because they don't know how to initiate? Or does the child not initiate because you always jump in too quickly first? You always say something first. And again, that's not a criticism of the adults in your team. That's just because we're told to enrich language and talk to children, when a child is a bit quieter and there's a gap, we very rarely just sit quietly. We fill that gap by adding language. But sometimes for some children, we can kind of push them back into like a pattern of quite passive interaction. And so for some of our children, when we're thinking, I want to improve talk, it's more complicated than just their sentences need to get longer, their vocabulary needs to get better. Actually, what they need to do is to talk more, to interact more, and then we'd have more opportunities to talk to them, and then they'd have more opportunities to talk to us. They'd have more opportunities to talk with their peers, so that actually, although we want them to use more words and use more sentences, actually, when we think about it, they're actually not having many conversations or initiating or talking to that many people. So again, if you notice a child like that, it's very, very important that you talk to your team about taking a slightly different route. And what we need to do when we've got children like that is to go into an area where they are and maybe pick up a resource very similar to what they're doing and almost like copy and model what they're doing, but not to try and get them to talk, just to play alongside them as if you were two children playing in parallel. And just give the child some space and some time. Because if you give the child some space and some time, then chances are they might suddenly say something. But normally you've gone in and you've said something first, and they needed a bit more space, they needed a bit more time. And even if you give them some time and some space and they don't say anything, after a while, at least just wait for them to do something. And then, a bit like those early strategies, say something about what they've done. So again, they haven't initiated the interaction with talk yet. That will come later. But what they've done is they have initiated the interaction with a non-verbal turn. And so again, that's just about using those interaction strategies, but also to make sure that we are continuing to have children who can not just respond to us, but who can start the conversation going as well. So what I'm going to do is I am going to quickly think about where that looks on the skills framework very, very quickly. We're not going to get too worried about the skills framework today. We're going to come back and look at the skills framework in a little bit more detail at the start of the next session. We don't want to get too worried about that. And we're also, I'm also going to mention now that when you get the CPD index via email, you can just leave it if you like and just watch this session again, or get your team to watch this session. But if you do think, we've got children who need more work on that type of thing, I want to know a little bit more about that compartment in my strategy toolbox. On the early language page, there are some videos that will go into much more detail about those different compartments of the language page. But it's an Excel spreadsheet and there's little tabs across the bottom, and you want to be going on the early language page, and then you might want to just watch one thing, two things on there if you want to, in order to look at things in more in depth, or to take yourself on to the next level, and just ignore everything else. We must remember that the toolkit is a toolkit. It's not for you to watch everything, think about reading everything at all or using everything. We're going to walk you through how to put things into your practice. But if you do want to dabble into the toolkit, that would be one good place to go if you want to. The other good place to go if you want to would be to log into the website, download the files, and there's quite a few different folders. If you want to have a little rummage through the skill information folder, but that would only be, I suppose, when we start using the skills framework a little bit more and you think, oh, I've got a child who needs to work on that skill step. I would like to think about what I do already, but I'd like some more ideas. The information in the skill, the information in the skill information folder will help you with that. So we'll talk about that a little bit more next time when we start talking about specific skills and specific ways of using the learning environment. So of course, we're going to look at the skills framework very briefly in a minute, but just to kind of round off the PowerPoint really, and to kind of almost round off the session before we have a look at the skills framework, is to remember all we're wanting from this afternoon is for you to go back to your setting and to think about your target children, not necessarily all of them to begin with, maybe just some of them, and to think about those children who are not meeting age-related expectations where you have a level of concern. From what we've talked about already in this session, what strategies do you already put in place within your setting? And also, do you put those strategies in place with the younger children, but actually you'd never thought about using them with the older children who have got skill gaps? Or do you do that already as well? And if you've got certain children, have a think about which strategies do you think you would like to try out with those different children? Do you think a certain child would benefit from those early communication strategies, or actually is that child's skills a little bit too far on for that, and that actually you would want to try some strategies a little bit further up in the toolkit? Or is it that when I talked about children who had got grammatical immaturities, or when I talked about children who were very quiet and passive, you thought, oh my gosh, that makes me think of Joshua. Okay, we want to try those strategies with, you know. So again, it's about hopefully listening today, hopefully having some things that you're doing already kind of confirmed, maybe learning a few ideas, but to go back and think, right, okay, what can we have a go with? What can I put in place? And remember that this will also involve bringing your team along, maybe watching the recording, maybe not. That's up to you. But certainly when you're beginning to talk about what strategies you use already, let's try this strategy, let's have a think about what that means, let's have a go. You know, it's important that it's not just you doing it, that you bring other members of your team along, because everybody interacts with these target children. So I'm going to quickly come out of that. And sorry, that was just to say that the next session is going to be on the targeted use of the learning environment. Have I stopped sharing? I can now see you again, Beth. Have I stopped sharing my PowerPoint, or is it still being shared?
Yes, you've stopped sharing it now, Kirsty.
Now then, do you want us to have a quick look at the skills framework, or do you think that that's enough for now?
I think you could just show people just so they know when they get it through, just give them a little bit of an overview.
So this might have arrived with some of you already, or it will certainly be arriving this week. When we talk about the toolkit, I've mentioned the CPD. I've also mentioned the skill information folder on the downloadable area. The main document in the toolkit, which we are working you towards using, and this afternoon we've talked about how you can use some interaction strategies to build skills in children and to fill certain skill gaps. All of those skills are plotted out on a big poster that will come in a poster tube if it hasn't already, which is called the Skills Framework poster. And do you know what? When you get it out the tube, you'll go, ooh, looks a little bit much. It's just child development. It's a developmental grid. That's all it is. And over time, we'll begin to use that grid to drill down and pinpoint what exactly certain children need and what exactly are the skill gaps that are having the biggest impact for different children, i.e. what do you need to focus on? And we've kind of talked about that a little bit this afternoon, but we've talked about it more generally around this notion of a toolbox of interaction strategies. But let me just try and share it now, not to kind of say go back and you need to learn it and memorize it and start particularly utilizing it. I want you to focus on your interactions and your strategies first. But let me just kind of explain how some of those interaction strategies marry up with this skills framework. So let's see if this will work. So is that now sharing the skills framework, Beth?
It is. We can see it.
Can you see it as a full screen, or can you see yourself hiding behind it?
You can see that part, but we can also see us behind that as well.
Maximize it so I can zoom in a little bit. Means I've got to hide you again, Beth. But
yeah, no, that's fine.
So again, it's a skills framework. It has got I'm going to zoom in a little bit, but we're not going to read the details, so don't worry. So we've got different skills across the bottom. So we've got auditory skills, which are children's listening skills, which we talked about a bit today. We've got receptive language skills, which is the orange bit, which is their understanding of what we say, which we talked a bit about today. We've got their vocabulary skills, which is their ability to learn words, which we also talked about today. We've got their sentence skills, which is their ability to use sentences and grammatical structures and things, which we talked about today. We'll whistle past that bit because we didn't specifically talk about that today. We've got their ability to use speech sounds, which again we talked about briefly today. And we've got children's ability to play, which is the symbolic skill strand, and their ability to have interaction and communication skills, which is called pragmatics on Launchpad, which we talked about today. We didn't talk about visual and we didn't talk about motor. They're very important, but we're focusing on about speech and language. Now, it reads from bottom up, and again, I don't want you to get worried about the detail, but we've got this at first kind of phase of development, and then we've got systematic preparation, and then we've got moving on. Now, if you're working in a PVI setting, at most you will be working with children in the red bit, and at best with your 3 to 4 year olds you will be moving them through the yellow bit. If you're working in a PVI setting, which you all are, you will not even have to think at all about the green bit or most of the bits at the top of the yellow, because you'll be working with the younger children much further down the Launchpad. So when I was talking about younger children and strategies to support early skills, I was really talking about strategies that would put things in place in the red bit of Launchpad. And when I was talking about moving children on with listening and understanding, I was beginning to talk about strategies that would move children from the red into the lower bits of the yellow on Launchpad. And when I was talking about building talk, I was talking about doing the same thing again and with speech sounds, but you're just lifting them off the bottom and you're trying to build their skills and kind of move them into the yellow part of Launchpad. So let's just kind of very, very quickly. So link about that skill toolbox. So when we talked about those early communication strategies, I'm really talking about, can we put these skills in place, these early symbolic, these early pragmatic, these early communication skills in place, and with those very same strategies, can I build some really early listening, some really early auditory attention, and some really early understanding, and some really early vocabulary? That's all we were talking about in relation to those very early strategies about positioning, following the child's lead. When we were talking about the next bank of strategies, which I coloured as an orange, we were talking about strategies that would build those auditory attention skills a little bit further, but they would particularly build children's understanding of language a little bit further, and they would build the child's ability to learn and understand words a little bit further. So again, by interacting with children in that way, you will be putting some of these skills on the skills framework in place without realizing it, just because you're interacting with them in the right high quality way. When we talked about those skills to boost sentence skills, repeat back and add one, repeat back and refine, when we talked about repeating back speech sounds in the right way, we're talking about building and lifting these sentence skills and moving them up the framework, and then also building and moving these speech sound skills up the framework as well, just through our interactions. And when we talked about making sure that children can initiate, we were looking a little bit further up this pragmatic section, which was about, can children, it was this very specific skill set here, begin to initiate interactions using talk. And next time, when we talk about use of the learning environment, we will talk quite a lot about using our resources to do lots of turn taking to boost these skills, but to also build listening skills. And we'll talk about other ways we can use the environment in a targeted way to build understanding, to build vocabulary. So again, don't worry too much about needing to know the Launchpad skills framework like the back of your hand yet. It's about saying, focus on the practical, focus on those interactions to begin with. But again, realize that if you begin to use these strategies, you will be moving children on that framework. When we begin to talk about using the environment in a targeted way, you will be beginning to shift these children on the framework. And the more we talk about the practical, the more we'll begin to kind of look a little bit more at the framework, so that eventually we can begin to use it to identify and drill down and identify gaps and next steps for certain children. So, do we want to stop the recording, Beth?
Yeah, I'll stop that now. Thank you, Kirsty. That was great.
Thank you up. I couldn't see anybody when I was sharing my screen, so I couldn't even see